I suffer from schizophrenia. Before you jump to any conclusions about me, before that word schizophrenia flashes its stigma and makes you think of serial killers, mass shooters, and the like, let me dispel a few things. I'm not Norman Bates. I'm not Ted Bundy. As a matter of fact, most sufferers of this illness shy away from violence. I do not have multiple personalities. Dissociative identity disorder is a completely different condition than what I have. Most of the time, I'm just like you. I go to work, I watch television, I read books, listen to music, indulge my hobbies, and spend time with people I love. I just occasionally see and hear things that aren't really there. When this happens, when I hallucinate or hear voices, I refer to these episodes as experiencing interference, because that's how it feels to me. They're interruptions in my everyday life. It's also a good way for me to signal to someone I trust, who knows about my condition, that I'm in the midst of an episode without having to use that word. I simply tell them, I'm sorry, there's some interference happening, and they understand. Not everyone is understanding. My father was one of those people. I was diagnosed at a very young age. I was only 6 when a child psychiatrist reluctantly wrote schizophrenia onto my diagnostic chart. It's not a diagnosis assigned lightly, especially to children. Most people with this illness don't begin displaying symptoms until the late teens or early 20s. I was 6. However, in a weird way, I consider this a blessing. I never had to experience the jarring phenomenon of living a normal life to suddenly having the carpet pulled out from beneath my feet. Better to be born blind than lose your sight later in life. I've never known anything else. This has also given me a long time to come to terms with my illness and to learn to live with it. I take medication, and as long as I stay on them, most of my days are just as boring and mundane as everyone else's. Mild episodes will always happen, but the big ones, the ones ranging on the scale 8 or above, are few and far between. The most difficult thing about living with schizophrenia is not always being able to tell what's real from what's not. Sometimes it's very clear. If I see a purple elephant riding a tricycle through my living room, I can pretty much assume that it isn't real and not give it much thought. The ones that get to me are the more subtle ones. Answering a phone that wasn't ringing, responding to someone calling my name when there was no one, attempting to sit in a chair that's not really there. This sort of thing can be extremely embarrassing when they happen in public, so I tend to stay away from most people. I know I come across as creepy to some. Strange. It's like they know there's something off about me, but they just can't pinpoint what it is. Another annoying thing about this illness are the delusions. I've been fortunate, though. I haven't been plagued by delusions the way some schizophrenics are. I don't believe the government has planted a chip in my brain or that I've been abducted by aliens. I don't buy into conspiracy theories or anything like that. However, there's always that danger. I'm always afraid of going off the deep end that way, so I avoid anything that might trigger it. Sometimes all it takes is for a simple idea to take root. A word, a phrase. It's not always purple elephants. Oftentimes, it's something much worse. One thing I avoid above all else is religion. I don't mean that to sound disrespectful to anyone who's religious. A common delusion for schizophrenics to fall into is the belief that they're hearing the voice of God, or that their hallucinations are actually angels or demons trying to show them visions. I've even had well-meaning people tell me that I'm not mentally ill at all, that I'm gifted. I can see into the spiritual realm, whereas others cannot. Of course, that's ridiculous. This is not a gift. Yet I do fear someday believing it. Who wouldn't want to believe that they're special that way? I suppose that's why it's such a common thing. Yet it's very dangerous thinking. As appealing as the notion of being chosen by God is, the reality is that I have an illness. It isn't pretty. It isn't romantic. It just is. Besides that, I don't have such a great track record with religion. My father, I mentioned him earlier, was a Southern Baptist preacher in the backwoods of Louisiana where I grew up. He was a devout Christian and held his family, myself included, to strict standards. We were examples for the community, and he took that position very seriously. In public, anyway. Behind closed doors, things were quite different. My father drank heavily and had a hellfire and brimstone temper. It went even beyond that, however. There was a meanness in him, a side the rest of the congregation never saw. He reveled in his position of power over his followers, and that bled heavily into our home life. We weren't his family. We were his flock. You see this scar across the corner of my mouth? That was delivered with a strip of barbed wire. I could show you my arms and my back as well, but I keep those covered. No matter the weather, I'm always in long sleeves. Having a schizophrenic son was not news my father took well. At first, he didn't believe there was such a thing. He was convinced I was behaving this way for attention, claiming to see things that weren't real. Then it got more sinister. My father became seized with the idea that I was in fact possessed. My hallucinations were satanic visions. I was hearing the voice of the devil. That's when I stopped being human in my father's eyes. I was no longer his son. I was a thing to be tormented whenever he saw fit. He derived a sick pleasure in not just the physical torture, the beatings, the burns, the chokings, the cuts, but the psychological torture as well. He stopped calling me by my name and instead used names like Schizo or his personal favorite, Hellspawn. He enjoyed taking advantage of my fragile psychological state. He would say or do things he knew would trigger an episode, and then use that as further evidence that I was filled with the devil. One day, when I was about 7, he came home in a drunken stupor as usual, but this time he clutched something in his left hand as he staggered through the front door. At first, I thought it was some sort of dead rodent, but when he brought it into the light, it was clear. It was a teddy bear, torn in places, with matted fur and bald spots. In his gravelly, slurred voice, he tossed it at my face and said, "Here you go, Hellspawn. Pulled that out of the dumpster for you. Mind you watch out, it's got a mind of its own." With that, he plopped on the sofa and passed out. Mind of its own. That's all it took. That simple phrase. A seed was planted. I regarded the haggard thing my father had thrown at me. It stank. I believed him when he said he pulled it out of the garbage. My first inclination was to just throw it away. In a few hours, my father would probably not remember giving it to me and would never miss it. But what if he did? What if he got angry that I tossed it out? Hanging on to a smelly, rotten stuffed animal seemed more appealing than whatever punishment my father might inflict on me, so I took it up to my room. This was most likely some sort of mind game. He wanted to see how long he could make me keep this thing. Make me sleep with it. Make me take it to school. Make me eat meals with it. As his petty torments went, this seemed pretty mild, so I figured I could take it. It was just an old bear, after all. But those words kept seeping into my brain. Mind of its own. I began to regard the bear with suspicion. When I was 7, I didn't have the discernment skills to be able to tell when a delusion or an episode was about to overtake me. I'm much older now, and I've lived with this for years. I now have coping skills and strategies I can use to combat things like this. But back then, I did not. I stared into the beady plastic eyes of the bear, and I could feel it staring back at me. It has a mind of its own.